My uncle Clete built the cabin in 1989 on 11 acres of timber ground in the Kiamichi Mountains, about 4 miles southeast of Honobia, Oklahoma. He drove the corner stakes himself, felled the first pines himself, and paid cash for the materials out of a coffee can he'd been filling since he got back from Vietnam. It took him 3 summers to finish it. He'd work on it in the off-season, drive down from Tulsa in his old F-150 with a load of lumber in the bed and 2 weeks of leave saved up. And he'd frame and nail and shingle until the money ran out, then go back and refill the can. By the time he drove the last nail, the forest had already started to grow back around it the way forest does down there, like it's constantly trying to reclaim what you've cleared. He called it a hunting camp, but it was really just home with a different zip code. He was down there every season, whitetail in November, turkey in spring, and in between he'd go just to be there, fish the lower creek bottom, walk the timber, sit on the porch, and watch the light change. My father went with him most years. I started going when I was 8. My first memory of the place is the smell of it, coming through the truck window on the last stretch of gravel road before you see the cabin. That particular combination of creek damp and cedar and something older underneath. Something that the Kiamichi country has and nowhere else does. By the time I was 12, I'd learned to tell which ridge the deer were bedding on by the direction the crows flew at dusk, and I knew every trail within a mile of that cabin the same way you know the layout of your own kitchen. You don't think about it, you just move. There are things the Kiamichi country does to you that take years to name. The cold down there is not the clean, dry cold of the plains. It comes up from the creek bottoms damp and heavy, and it settles into your clothes in a way that stays with you even after you're inside and the propane heater has been running an hour. By the 3rd morning of any November trip, your joints know the elevation. The short-leaf pines hold water in their bark, and when the temperature drops fast after dark, they make a sound like knuckles cracking, random and sharp, that you learn to stop hearing over years, the same way you stop hearing a clock. You learn which ridges catch the morning fog and hold it until 9, and which ones burn clear by 7. You learn that the specific smell of leaf rot after the first hard freeze, that particular sweetness underneath the decay, means the deer will move early because the mast is at its best for maybe 4 more days. You learn the creek, not the average character of it, but the specific character of it in each season. The way it sounds in high water in April, when everything has a rushing quality that makes conversation difficult. The way it sounds in October when it's dropped to its clear low self, and you can hear individual rocks shifting in the current from 30 yards away. You learn what the crows are telling you when they work the East Ridge at dusk. You learn all of it over years, and then one day you realize you don't think about it anymore. The land has become a kind of language you speak without translating. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. The Kiamichi Range is the kind of country that doesn't get written about much outside of hunting forums and the occasional outdoor magazine piece. It's the southern tale of the Ouachita Mountains, rolling hardwood ridges and creek bottoms choked with cedar and shortleaf pine, rhododendron thickets so dense in places you can't push through them, standing upright. The Kiamichi River itself is not a large river by any standard measurement, but it has a character that bigger rivers don't have. It moves slow and dark with tannins from the leaf litter, and the smaller tributaries that feed it run cold even in summer if you find them deep enough in the limestone cuts. Those cuts go down sometimes 15-20 feet, sheer limestone walls with ferns growing in the seeps, and the air temperature drops 5 degrees when you stand at the bottom. The soil in the bottom country is black and soft, and holds prints like plaster, which matters to this story. In November, the sky through the bare trees looks like hammered tin, and the air smells like cold mud and leaf rot and wood smoke from somebody's chimney half a county away. In July, it smells like hot pine resin and creek clay, and the particular sweetness of ripening sumac. The country has a different personality in every season, and I've known them all across 30 years of going there. It's not dramatic country in the way the Rockies are dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles into you over years until one day you realize you can't fully breathe anywhere else. We're out of cell range on the property, always have been. The nearest signal is a partial bar on a ridge about 1.5 miles west. AT&T, which hasn't worked reliably since roughly 2015. The nearest town with anything resembling services is Talihina, which is a 40-minute drive on a combination of state highway and gravel county road, and that's if the road is dry. After a good rain, the last 2 miles can add another 30 minutes. The nearest emergency services are longer than that. This matters for practical reasons when you're managing a remote property, but it matters for this story for a different reason. When things started happening at the cabin, the only people who knew about them were the people who were there. There was no quick call to make. There was no help an hour away. There was just the land and what was on it and what you decided to do about it. My uncle Clete died in the spring of 2013. Pancreatic cancer, which is a hard way to go, and a fast one from the outside. 4 months from the diagnosis he got at the end of January to the morning in May when my father called me before 6. Clete was 67. He'd been healthy his whole life in the way that men who work with their hands and spend time outside are healthy, not because they're careful about it, but because the life itself doesn't give illness much room. The cancer didn't care about any of that. He left the property to my father and my father's sister Rennie, who had visited the cabin exactly twice in 24 years, and had no interest in maintaining it or paying taxes on it. My father bought out her share for a number that was fair to both of them, and the cabin became his, which in practice meant it became mine to manage because my father's knee had gone bad enough by then that the drive out and the rough ground were getting hard for him. I took over the maintenance trips. I kept going every hunting season the way I always had. The place didn't feel different at first. It felt exactly the same, which was almost worse because you'd be sitting on the porch with your coffee and reach over to set it on the rail and expect to see Clete sitting in the other chair, and the other chair would be empty. Quick thing before we get into it. A lot of what I've learned about
Quick thing before we move on. I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
My wife Becca started coming down with me in 2016. She's a practical woman, East Texas raised, and she doesn't do things for atmosphere or because they're supposed to be beautiful. She goes places because there's something real there worth going for. I'd been telling her about the Kiamichi for our entire marriage, and she'd been politely skeptical in the way people are when they've heard someone talk about a place too many times. She finally came in November of 2016, and I watched her sit on the porch on the second morning with her coffee, looking at the fog sitting in the creek bottom, watching a spike buck wade through it with no sound at all, and I could see her understanding something she hadn't been able to get from a description. She didn't say much. She just nodded to herself. She's been coming every year since. My daughter Marisol came for the first time in 2018. She was 6 years old, and she took to it the way some kids take to water. Immediately and completely, like she'd been waiting for the permission to be somewhere like this. By the second afternoon, she was ranging the yard by herself, turning over rocks at the creek edge, bringing me things she'd found. A crayfish claw, a piece of shale with a fossil impression in it, a crinoid stem, maybe 300 million years old, which is what happens to ancient seafloors when mountain ranges fold up over them. That's the Ouachita country in a nutshell. It was ocean floor once. Deep ocean, and you can still find the evidence of it in the rock if you look. The first thing I need to tell you about is the boundary. There's a creek that runs east to west about 300 yards north of the cabin, small tributary of the Kiamichi River. No name on any topographic map I've been able to find, including the 124,000 USGS quad sheet for that area. I've checked the Oklahoma Water Resources Board's tributary database, and it's not listed there either. It's a seasonal creek in the sense that its character changes dramatically between seasons, but it never fully dries. Even in August, it holds water in the deeper cuts, spring-fed from somewhere up in the limestone above. In spring, it runs maybe 12 feet across and fast enough to move gravel. By October, it's settled down to 8 feet or so, slow, clear over the shale bottom. The limestone banks on the north side are higher than the south side in most places. A foot or two of exposed rock before the soil starts, and the trees on the north bank lean toward the water more than the south side trees do, reaching for the light over the creek gap. For years, my uncle talked about the north side of that creek the way people talk about another country. Not with fear, not with anything dramatic, with something that felt more like the respect you give a neighbor's fence line when the neighbor hasn't done anything wrong, but you know the fence is there for a reason. He'd hunt up to it and stop. He knew where the whitetail crossings were, the the places where deer went north across the water to the acorn flats on the other side, and he'd work those crossings from the south bank. If he pushed deer across it, he'd let them go rather than follow. I thought it was superstition at first. He was a man who had a lot of superstitions, born partly from the war and partly from 40 years of reading animals and terrain, where your accuracy was the margin between going home fed or going home empty. I didn't press him on the creek rule, I just followed it the way you follow the customs of a place you love, without requiring a full explanation of every custom. Looking back, I think he was teaching me what he knew, in the only way he knew how to teach it, which was by example. He couldn't have told me in words what was north of that creek in a way I would have believed, so he didn't try. He just kept the rule and let me watch him keep it year after year, and trusted that eventually I'd understand what the rule was for. In 2012, the year before he died, I asked him about it directly. We were sitting on the porch after dark, first week of November. 2 cups of bad percolated coffee and the kind of cold that was just starting to have some teeth in it. I asked him why he never crossed that creek. He was quiet for a long time. He had a way of being quiet that didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like he was selecting carefully, the way a man does when the words matter, and he wants to get them right. He said, "The first time I saw it was 2 years after I built this place. In 1991, late September, warm still, middle of the night. I came out to use the outhouse, and something was standing at the tree line on the north side of the yard, just standing there, upright. I stood on the porch for maybe 30 seconds trying to figure out what I was looking at before I admitted I didn't know. It wasn't a bear. I've seen black bears on their hind legs, and I know what that looks like, and this wasn't that. The proportions were wrong. The head sat on the neck differently. It was taller than it should have been, taller than any bear I've ever seen standing, taller than a person by a good margin. And then it turned around and walked back into the trees on 2 legs, and I went inside and got my rifle and sat with it until the sun came up. I said, 'You never told anyone.' He said, 'Who would I call? And what would I tell them?' Game warden's going to drive 4 miles on a dirt road in the middle of the night to look at something I can't describe that walked into the woods. And then what? They put a chain on my gate, and 6 guys with flashlights spook every deer on the property, and I lose the place, practically speaking, because the state decides it's a nuisance management issue. I wasn't going to do that. I said, 'But you kept coming back.' He said, 'Of course I kept coming back. It never did a single thing to me.' I came back the very next weekend. He said, 'After that first time, I started paying attention to what was already there that I hadn't been reading right. The marks on certain trees north of the creek, deep parallel grooves in the bark, at a height no deer or hog could reach. The beds in the leaf litter in the north timber, too large for deer, too far from water for hog. The sound that came off the north ridge sometimes late at night, low, like nothing I had a word for. I'd been hunting this property for 2 years, and I'd been reading it as deer country. After that night in 1991, I started reading it as something else's country too. And once I started reading it that way, it was very clear that whatever was up there in the north woods had been there a lot longer than I had. I said, 'You think it's still there?' He looked at me and didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. That was the only direct conversation we ever had about it. He was dead 7 months later. I inherited his knowledge of the property along with the deed. And I spent the next several years sitting with what he'd told me and trying to figure out whether I believed it or whether 40 years of solitary timber country had taken a toll on him, the way it takes a toll on some men. The honest answer is I didn't know what to believe, so I did what he'd done. I kept the creek rule the same way I kept his other rules, the one about leaving the west draw alone until the 3rd week of November, the one about not taking a shot until you'd watched the buck for 3 full minutes. I kept the rules of a man who'd learned the land with a patience I didn't quite have yet, but was working toward. My first solo trip was November 2014. My father's knee had gone bad enough that the drive and the rough ground were too much for him that year, and I went alone for the first time. 5 nights by myself in the cabin, which sounds like nothing if you're the kind of person who camps alone. But this is different from camping. Camping alone is temporary, and you know it's temporary, and the forest around a campsite has a transient quality because you know you're moving through it. The cabin is permanent. The land around it is known. And when you're in it alone for the first time, the known quality of it shifts slightly. You hear things you didn't notice when there was someone else in the room to absorb the attention. That first night, I did something I'd never done before at the cabin. I made 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. I didn't notice until I was pouring the second one, and then I stood in the small kitchen with the percolator in one hand and understood something about how much of what I'd called familiarity was actually the sum of two people in a space. I drank both cups. I sat in Clete's chair instead of the one I'd always used, and I looked at the empty chair across the room and I thought, this is how it is now, not with despair, with the specific adjustment you make when you're in the field and the conditions have changed, and you have to read the new conditions clearly before you can do anything useful. The facts were as follows. He was gone, the land was mine to tend, and I was going to be alone in this chair for every trip for the rest of my life, unless I brought someone with me. I sat with those facts until the percolator was cold. Then I turned out the lamp, lay down on the cot, and started reading the Korean War history I'd been meaning to finish for 2 years. I got 3 pages in. The first 2 nights were quiet in the way the Kiamichi is quiet, which is not silence but a layered absence of human sound with animal sound underneath. Coyotes at midnight, an owl working the creek bottom, the specific sound of big timber settling in the cold after the temperature drops fast, which sounds like someone tapping the walls from outside, and which you do not want to be hearing for the first time alone in a dark cabin without context for it. Third night. I was on the cot, maybe 11:30, reading the paperback I'd brought, the Korean War history. The propane lamp was on. I heard something in the yard. Deer come through the yard regularly. I know that sound. They're light-footed and variable. They stop and start. They move in the grass in a particular pattern that after enough time, you can distinguish from other movement in the dark without seeing anything. What I heard was not that. It was heavier, and the cadence was wrong, deliberate, even. Moving along the north side of the building at a pace that wasn't hurried or random. It passed the window, and I heard it round the corner. I set the book down. I didn't reach for the rifle. I just lay still and listened. It stopped at the northwest corner of the cabin. I heard it there for what I timed at just under 3 minutes by the watch I keep by the cot. 3 minutes of standing still at the corner of a building in the dark. Then the steps moved back the way they'd come, along the north wall, around the east end, and then gone, fading into whatever was north of the property line. I didn't sleep again that night. At first light, I went around the outside of the cabin and checked the north side. The ground there is packed clay and doesn't hold impressions well. But at the northwest corner, where the roof runoff has kept a strip of soil softer, I found 2 partial impressions in the damp earth. Partial is the right word. They were degraded by the clay, and I couldn't get clear toe definition. But the impressions were deep, consistent with significant weight, and the spacing between them was 48 inches. That's a 4-foot stride length standing still, just standing and taking a single step. No animal I know of in these woods has a standing stride of 4 feet that walks upright. A black bear's hind track stride, when it's walking normally, is about 24 inches. An adult human averages roughly 26 to 30 inches in a casual walking stride. What I was looking at was the footprint pattern of something considerably larger than either. I photographed the impressions with the digital camera I keep at the cabin. The photographs are in the notebook, labeled with date and description. I spent the rest of that trip hunting the south timber and the creek bottom, and not thinking too much about what I'd heard, or trying not to. I drove home at the end of the week, and I did not tell my father what had happened. I thought about it for most of the drive, and I decided that what I had was 2 degraded impressions in soft clay and a sound I couldn't identify, and that telling him would either worry him unnecessarily or open a conversation about my uncle's creek rule that I wasn't ready to have yet. What I did instead was start the notebook. I bought a standard spiral bound at the Walmart in McAllister on the way home. Nothing special. I dated the first entry November 14th, 2014, and I described what I'd heard and what I'd found and the measurements I'd made. I didn't have a system yet. It was just a description, the way you write something down when you need to get it out of your head and onto a page. But from that entry forward, the notebook has been part of every trip. 2015 was a dry year in the Kiamichi. The creek ran low by August, and by the time October came around, the silt deposits had been baked hard and then cracked in that specific pattern you get in limestone creek beds when the moisture leaves fast. I came down in October for preseason work, checking the stands, clearing shooting lanes. I walked the south bank of the unnamed creek on a Sunday morning, when the light was coming in, low and sideways through the post oaks, and I found a stretch of silt bar on the limestone shelf that had stayed soft enough, maybe 15 yards long, and in it, clear as anything I've ever read in my life, a set of tracks. I want to be specific about these because track analysis is where a lot of accounts like this fall apart, where the skeptic is right to be skeptical. I've been reading animal tracks since I was 8 years old. I know what a black bear's hind print looks like. The plantar surface is long, the heel is wide and rounded, the toes make a shallow arc with the middle toes longer. And in soft substrate, you'll often get claw impressions above the toes in a pattern that's specific to bear. I know what a feral hog track looks like. The dew claw impressions, the rounded toes side by side. I know what a deer track looks like. I know what a human track looks like. I have been looking at animal tracks in soft ground in the Ouachita country for 30 years. What I found on that silt bar was none of those things. 5-toed, 14 inches in length from heel to the front of the toe pad, 7 inches across at the widest point. The toes were set close together and forward, clustered at the front of the track rather than spread, which is the canine configuration, not the human configuration where the toes spread and splay under weight. The arch was minimal, barely present, which meant the weight was distributed differently than a human foot distributes weight. The heel impression was round and slightly shallower than I'd expect, for the amount of weight the depth at the ball suggested. Whatever made these tracks carried its weight forward on the ball of the foot, not balanced across the arch the way a human carries it. I measured 4 separate tracks with the tape measure I drove back into Talihina to buy at the hardware store because I hadn't brought one. The length variation between prints was less than a 1/4 inch, which means the stride was extremely consistent, not the variable stride you get from a running or frightened animal. And the stride length, toe of one print to heel of the next, was 68 inches, 5 feet 8 inches per stride, walking pace. I sat on the limestone shelf next to those tracks for a long time. The creek ran thin and clear below me. The oaks on the north bank were starting to color, that specific rust orange the post oaks go in October. A kingfisher worked the shallow pool 20 yards upstream without any awareness of me. I sat there and I thought about my uncle sitting with his rifle until morning in 1991, and I thought about the 3-minute pause at the northwest corner of the cabin, and I thought, okay, he was right. I took 18 photographs and made a tracing of the 3 clearest prints by pressing the notebook page flat on the substrate and tracing around them with a fine point marker, which gives you a dimensional record that photographs sometimes don't capture depending on the light angle. I numbered each tracing and annotated the stride measurements and put the date in the upper right corner of each page. Entry number 4 in the notebook, October 2015. That fall was when I called my father from the ridge with the partial signal and told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment in the way Clete had been quiet before he answered me on that porch in 2012. Then he said, "Clete always said something was up there." I said, "I know that now." He said, "You be careful down there." I said, "It doesn't seem interested in causing problems." He said quietly, like he was deciding whether to say it, "No, I don't suppose it does." I asked him, "Did Clete ever tell you directly what he saw?" My father said, "Once, just once. He told me about the first night in 1991, and he never brought it up again, and I never asked. Your uncle was not a man who said things twice." I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "Because you needed to learn the land first. You needed to know it well enough to trust what it showed you." He was quiet for another moment, and then he said, "And because some things you can't tell someone. They have to show you." That was the end of the conversation. I climbed back down the ridge and drove to the cabin and wrote the conversation in the notebook, verbatim, as best I could remember it. I do that sometimes, record conversations that seem important to the record, even if they're not field observations. The notebook is a history of the relationship, as much as it's a log of individual observations. 2016, I brought Becca for the first time, and I made the deliberate decision not to tell her anything about the North Woods until she'd had the chance to come to the property on its own terms. She's a careful observer, and she trusts what she sees, but she's also someone who would be shaped by knowing what to look for, and I didn't want her looking for anything. I wanted her to simply be there and let whatever she noticed come to her naturally. She noticed the creek on the second afternoon. We walked it together, south bank, and she stopped at one point and looked north across the water into the timber, and stood there for a moment before moving on. I didn't say anything. Later that evening on the porch, she said, "The north side of that creek is different." I said, "Different how?" She said, "I don't know." Quieter, she said, "The birds don't go over there." I hadn't consciously registered that, but when I thought about it, I realized she was right. The cardinals and the chickadees that worked the south side brush stayed on the south side. They didn't cross the water. I said, "You're very observant." She said, "I grew up in East Texas. You learn to read what the animals are telling you." I left it at that. I didn't tell her about the tracks or the footfall or the conversation with my father. I wanted more data first. Or maybe I just wasn't ready to say it out loud to someone who hadn't been going to this land for 30 years. The November of 2016. I came back alone after taking Becca home, a few extra days I'd saved. On the second night, I heard the vocalization for the first time. I'd heard sounds before, the footfall in 2014, sounds from the North Ridge that I'd cataloged as unidentified low-frequency vocalizations in the notebook without spending too much time on them. This was different. This was direct and close. It came at 11:40 at night, after I had turned out the lamp and was settling towards sleep. From the north, from past the creek, but not far past it, maybe 100 yards beyond the water. A sound that I've described in the notebook as follows: low, resonant, sustained for approximately 5 seconds. Not a howl, not a bark. Not a coyote sound, which I know well. Not a bear sound, which I also know. A vocalization that occupied the lower register of what I can hear, but felt like it was pressing against the edges of that register, like there was more below it that my hearing wasn't picking up. I felt it in my sternum before I fully heard it with my ears. The hair on my arms went up, which is not something that happens to me often. I lay in the dark and waited. 22 minutes later, it came again. Same duration, same quality, then silence. Complete and total, until the first birds at 4:30 in the morning. I wrote the entry by headlamp that night, timed the duration with the watch, wrote down every detail I could fix in words. And at the bottom of the entry I wrote, "This is not an animal I have a category for. This is not something I can explain away." Starting to understand what Clete understood. The next morning at first light, I walked north to the creek and checked the south bank. Nothing new in the silt at the crossing shelf. But on the soft ground just back from the water's edge on my side, I found a place where something had stood. Not a track exactly, more of a compression, a flattening of the leaf litter and the damp earth underneath it, in an area roughly 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. The kind of impression you'd get from something standing still in one place for a period of time. Standing on the south bank of the creek in the dark while it made that sound, or after, listening. It had been on my side of the water, not crossing into the yard, standing at the bank, looking south toward the cabin, standing still, and then going back north. I took a photograph of the compression and added it to the notebook and drove home the next day and spent most of the drive thinking about what the pattern was telling me. It had come to the south bank, stood there, made a sound that I couldn't classify, that did something to my nervous system that wasn't panic but was something adjacent to it, then left. That's not threatening behavior, that's something else. Assessment, maybe, curiosity. Whatever it is that something does when it wants to understand the nature of what's on the other side of a line without crossing the line. I thought about that for a long time. 2017 was the year I got systematic. I'd been keeping the notebook for 3 years, and the entries were good individual records, but they weren't a picture yet. I took a week off in October, which I almost never do since I save my time off for hunting seasons, and I drove down specifically to survey the North Quadrant. I want to be clear about what I mean by North Quadrant because the geometry of the property matters. The 11 acres is roughly rectangular, oriented east-west. The cabin sits in the southern third. The unnamed creek cuts across the upper third, east to west, leaving a strip of south bank timber between the cabin and the water, and everything north of the creek to the property line. The North Quadrant is those north acres, the timber I'd been keeping myself out of for 3 years of keeping my uncle's rule. What I did was walk the south bank of the creek for its entire length across the property, west edge to east edge, and survey everything visible on the north bank with a long glass. I wasn't crossing the water, I was reading the north side from my side. I did this for 4 consecutive mornings, different light conditions, different times of day, going slow and noting everything. The claw marks on the north bank trees were the most consistent finding. I identified and photographed 23 separate trees over that 4-day survey, all within the north-facing strip of timber that bordered the creek. Short-leaf pines and post oaks mostly, with a few red cedars. The marks on all of them started at a height of between 7 and 8 feet, measured by comparison against the tree's lower branches where I could estimate, all running downward. all in the same parallel configuration. 4 to 5 inches between the outer lines, which is the measurement I'd get from a hand with the fingers spread slightly, not tight together like a fist, not fully spread like a fan. A natural grip, fingers slightly apart. The depth varied, some were shallow, almost scrapes, like something running its nails down the bark casually. Others went in a half-inch or more, the kind of mark that would require real force against the bark of a mature shortleaf pine. The bark of a shortleaf pine is thick and hard, segmented in rectangular plates, and it takes effort to get a mark into it. These marks were in it. I made a diagram in the notebook of the 23 tree locations, keyed to a rough sketch of the creek corridor. When I laid the diagram out and looked at the distribution, the marks were heaviest at 3 places. The saddle at the northeast corner of the property where the terrain dips and the creek bends, the flat rock crossing point at the center of the creek run, and a spot about 200 yards east of the crossing, where the north bank flattened into a small bench before the timber thickened again. Those 3 spots are the natural travel points. If you were moving east to west along the north bank and you wanted to pause and mark something, you'd mark at the saddle, the crossing, and the bench. Those are the anchor points of the travel corridor. Something was marking its route. I say that the way a tracking expert says it, not the way a horror story says it. Territorial marking is common animal behavior. The interesting thing wasn't that it was happening. The interesting thing was the height and the configuration, what it told you about the anatomy of the thing doing it. I also found that October, the circle in the bark. About 60 yards north of the creek, on a pine trunk I could see clearly through the binoculars from my bank, there was a set of the usual parallel grooves, and above them, worked into the bark separately, a rough circle, the size of a basketball, maybe slightly smaller, made with a single point, not the 4 or 5 line configuration of the grip marks. A single claw, worked deliberately around the circumference, the line breaking in 2 places but closing back on itself. A circle. I photographed it at maximum zoom from my bank. The photograph is in the notebook. I've shown it to people over the years, and I let them draw their own conclusions. What I will tell you is that bark circles are not a natural occurrence. Bark ridges in concentric patterns as a tree grows. Woodpeckers make holes. Bears make long vertical gouges when they're climbing or scratching. Scrapes from deer antlers are low on the tree and follow the direction of the deer's movement. A circle at 8 feet, made with a single continuous line, is intentional. It means something. I don't know what it means, but it's in the record and it belongs there. There's a woman in Honobia, her name is Delma Birdsong, whose family has been in the Kiamichi Valley since before statehood. Her grandfather was Choctaw Nation, her grandmother was a mixed-blood Cherokee who married into the valley. She's in her late 70s now, and she knows every family that has land in this part of the mountains going back 100 years. I've known her since my uncle's time. She came to his memorial. She brought a dish that she set on the table without explanation. And she sat with the other neighbors and talked about what Clete had meant to the community out there, which was a lot. A man who respected his land and his neighbors and didn't cause trouble was a valued thing in a community where trouble was expensive. I went to see Delma in the fall of 2017 after my survey trip. I drove to her place, which is a clean white farmhouse on a gravel road about 3 miles from our property, and I sat at her kitchen table, and I told her what I'd been finding and what I'd heard and what my uncle had told me before he died. She listened to all of it without interrupting. She poured coffee from a percolator that looked exactly like my uncle's percolator, and she sat across from me with both hands around her mug, and she listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your uncle knew." I said, "He told me, before he died." She said, "He told me too once, a long time ago." She said, "The old people in this valley have always known, not the way you know something you can explain, the way you know where not to walk at night." She said, "There are names for it in Choctaw, but I'm not going to use them here because they're not mine to put in a story someone else is going to carry around." I said, "Have you ever seen one?" She was quiet for another moment. She said, "I saw something on the North Ridge when I was 12 years old. It was dawn. I was walking up to my grandfather's stand to bring him his breakfast. I saw something step out from behind a tree on the ridge above me and look down at where I was. I stopped and it stopped, and then it went back behind the tree, and I went the rest of the way up to my grandfather, and I never told him what I saw." She said, "I thought he'd think I was scared of nothing." She said, "I know now that he would have known exactly what it was and would have told me the same thing he told me every time we went into the deep timber. Stay south of the creek, stay south of the creek. My uncle's rule, Delma's grandfather's rule, the same rule by the same creek. I asked her how far back that instruction went. She said, farther back than I can trace. She poured us each a second cup from that old percolator, and she was quiet for a minute in a way that didn't feel like hesitation. It felt like she was selecting what belonged in a conversation with someone who wasn't from the valley by blood. When she spoke again, she said, the Choctaw families who settled this drainage after removal, they came into country that the families who were already here had rules about. Not warnings, rules. She said, the difference matters. A warning says, be afraid. A rule says, behave correctly. She put her hand flat on the kitchen table when she said that. A gesture I associated with her whenever she was being precise about something she didn't want misunderstood. She said, people make the mistake of thinking that if something is powerful and different from them, it must want to harm them. That's their fear talking, not the evidence. The evidence in this valley, going back as far as anyone could trace it in memory, was that if you kept your part of the arrangement, it kept its part. She said, there were accounts in the old memory of families who didn't keep their part. She said, the accounts don't end well, and I'm not going to repeat them here because they've been sensationalized enough by people who weren't from this valley. She said, what your uncle did was exactly right. He saw something, and he sat with his rifle until morning, and then he put the rifle down and went back. That decision told whatever was watching him something important about the kind of man he was. And it remembered. I said, so you think it knew him? She said, I think it knew every family that's lived in this drainage for a long time. She said, whether it knows them the way we know each other or by something else, I can't say. But it knows who keeps the arrangement and who doesn't. I sat with that for a long time on the drive home. What Delma was telling me is that whatever is in the north woods of our property and the north woods adjacent to it extending up the ridge had been there long enough that the instruction about it had become part of the cultural knowledge of the valley. Not a story, not a legend exactly, an instruction. A practical piece of information passed from generation to generation, the way you pass down which mushrooms are safe and which water is clean. You don't cross that creek. And the reason had been passed down long enough that Delma's grandfather knew it without knowing where it had come from. I wrote down everything she told me that night. I asked her permission first, and she said, write it down. She said, somebody should have it in writing before too many more people who know it are gone. The second notebook started in 2017 and the format changed. Date, time, temperature, moon phase, wind direction, precipitation, visibility. Then the observation in plain language. Then measurements and drawings on the facing page when I had them. The entry from the conversation with Delma is 3 pages long, handwritten, her words quoted as accurately as I could recall them. It's the most important entry in any of the 3 notebooks. 2018 was the year Marisol came for the first time, which you already know about. She was 6. She ranged the yard that October afternoon, with the complete fearlessness of a child who has not yet been taught to be afraid of the outdoors. And I was inside when Becca came and got me quietly and said, come look at this. Marisol was standing at the edge of the yard, at the fence line on the north side that separates the yard from the rough timber between the cabin and the creek. She was standing completely still, with her face turned north, watching something. I came up beside her, and she didn't acknowledge me. She just kept watching the direction she was watching. I looked where she was looking. The tree line was maybe 40 yards away, the first good stand of short-leaf pines, and in the shadows between 2 trunks, I could see a shape. I couldn't resolve it clearly at that distance in the failing afternoon light. It was upright, it was tall, and then it wasn't there. Marisol turned around and walked back toward the cabin, and I said, what were you looking at? She said, that Dogman. She said it the way a child says a thing that is simply factual, not dramatic, just stating the category it belonged to in her head. The Dogman. Like she'd already named it. I said, what did he look like? She said, big. She said, he had a dog face. She said, he was just looking at me. Becca put her hand on Marisol's shoulder and said, were you scared? Marisol thought about it the way she thinks about things, actually considering the question rather than giving the quick answer. Then she said, no. She said, he wasn't doing anything mean. I said, have you seen him before? She said, no. She said, but I kind of knew he was there. Kids in the deep woods do sometimes sense things that adults, whose attention has been trained onto specific frequencies, miss. I don't know if she'd been picking up on something all afternoon. I don't know if the shape in the tree line had been there for a while before she noticed it. What I know is that a 6-year-old child stood at the fence line and held her ground and was not afraid, and the thing in the trees, whatever it was, did not approach. It stood where it was for however long it had been there, and it looked, and then it was gone. I wrote the entry that night, after she was asleep. The exact time of the sighting was 5:21 p.m., based on Becca's phone, which she'd been checking when she came to get me. Temperature 44 degrees, wind light from the southwest, overcast sky. Shape visible for approximately 45 seconds before it moved back from the tree line. That night, after Marisol was asleep, Becca and I sat on the porch with the lamp off, and I told her everything, the full account, the 2014 footfall and the impressions, the 2015 tracks on the silt bar, the vocalization in November 2016, the 2017 survey, and the claw marks and the circle in the bark, the conversation with Delma Birdsong, all of it. She listened the way she listens, without interrupting, processing. When I finished, she said, "So your uncle kept this rule about the creek because something lives on the other side of it." I said, "That's what I believe." She said, "And in all those years, since 1991, it has never hurt anyone." I said, "Not to my knowledge. Not Clete, not Darvis, who's been working that land across the road since before Clete bought ours. Not Delma, who saw it as a child. Nobody." She said, "And you've been keeping the creek rule?" I said, "Yes," she said. "And when Marisol stood at that fence just now, it looked at her and left." I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay." I said, "Okay, what?" She said, "Okay, I'm not afraid of it." She said, "I'm not going to pretend it's not there, and I'm not going to pretend it's not what it obviously is, and I'm going to keep the same rule Clete kept." She said, "And I'd like it if you could be a little less cryptic when things like this are happening and you want me to understand the land." That was fair. I told her she was right. She was. I mentioned Darvis just now, which I should explain. His name is Darvis Holk, and he's in his mid-70s, and he was born in the Kiamichi Valley to a family that had been there since before Oklahoma became a state in 1907. His great-grandfather's name is on the early Choctaw Nation land records for this drainage. He's been farming and running cattle on the land across the gravel road from our west fence line for his entire adult life. He and my uncle had been neighbors for 24 years. After Clete died, Darvis checked on the property during the months nobody was there, walked the fence line, made sure the gate was locked, called my father if anything needed attention. He didn't ask for anything in return. That's just how it's done in the Kiamichi Valley. I'd been meaning to ask Darvis about the North Woods since the conversation with Delma. I finally did in the spring of 2018, a few months before the October trip when Marisol first came. I stopped at his place on the way out, which I usually did to let him know I was going to be on the property. He was working on a piece of equipment in his drive, a baler, with something wrong with the hydraulics. He came out from under it, and I asked him if he had a few minutes, and he said sure, and we sat on the tailgate of his truck. I told him what I was finding. I tried to be matter-of-fact about it, just the observations, the tracks, the claw marks, the sounds. I watched his face while I talked. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man hearing a report on a situation he already knew the basic shape of. When I finished, he said, "I heard something once." He said, "I've heard it more than once." He said, "Late at night in the summer, when I sleep with the window open, I've heard something from the direction of your north ridge that doesn't have a name I know of. Long, low." He said, "My dogs go quiet when it happens. They don't bark, they don't howl, they go completely quiet, which my dogs never do for anything else." He said, "I saw something moving in the tree line on your north property in the winter of 2009. First week of February, snow on the ground, middle of the day. I stopped the truck and I watched it walk between two trees on the ridge, upright, too tall, and then it was gone." I said, "Clete never talked to you about it?" He said, "We never talked about it directly, but I noticed that he never hunted north of that creek, and I never crossed it either." He said, "Some things out here you just know not to bother." He said, "I'll tell you what I know, which isn't much. My father used to say there were things in the deep timber above the valley that the old Choctaw families knew not to disturb. He didn't know specifics because by the time he was told it, it was just a rule without an explanation. He said, Some rules outlive their reasons, and some rules, the ones that matter, outlive their reasons because the reason is still true. That's one of the best things anybody has said to me about any of this. I wrote it in the notebook that evening, word for word as best I could. November 2018 was my first trip back since the October sighting. I was there for 5 days, hunting the South Timber and the creek bottom. 3 nights were quiet. On the 4th night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound I'd first heard in 2016, the low vocalization from the north. But this time, there were 2 of them, not simultaneously. One from the north, from past the creek, and then roughly 4 minutes later, one from the east ridge, farther away, answering. The same character, the same frequency, but the East Ridge one was slightly different in quality, the way 2 voices can produce the same note, and you still know they're different voices. 2 of them were communicating. Across a distance I estimated at half a mile or more. I lay in the dark and listened to the silence that followed the second sound, and I thought about pack structure, about territorial acoustics, about what it means when 2 individuals in the same general area vocalize to each other at 2 in the morning in the deep timber. I thought about the circle in the bark. I thought about Delma saying the instruction had been there longer than she could trace. I thought about what an instruction that old implies about what generated it. Not a one-time sighting, not a rumor, but enough ongoing presence across enough generations that the instruction became as automatic as which water you drink from. Stay south of the creek, as fundamental as that. I thought, there is a community of them, not just one. There has been a community of them for a very long time. December 2018, I drove down for a weekend specifically to check the property after an ice storm that had come through and taken limbs down across the county. That trip wasn't about observation, it was maintenance. But on the morning I was packing to leave, I walked the north fence line and found something I hadn't expected. On the north fence post at the northwest corner of the property, the post that anchors the fence where our land meets the county road easement, there was a mark, fresh. The wood was pale and clean, where the bark had been torn away. A single vertical groove about 6 inches long at the top of the post. The post is 7 feet tall. The groove was at the top. Something had reached over the top of the fence post and left a single mark in the treated lumber. I stood there in the cold, with the ice still in the tree branches and the ground hard as concrete under the frost. And I looked at that single groove in the fence post, and I thought about what it was telling me. Not a warning. It didn't have the character of a warning, which is multiple marks, force, emphasis. It was more like a notation, a single mark at the perimeter. I'm here. I see the boundary. I see that you see it. I photographed it, and I wrote the entry, and I drove home. Spring 2019 was turkey season. I came down in April. There's a bottom along the east side of the property, south of the creek, where a small drainage comes down off the ridge, and the turkeys roost in the big red oaks along the flat. I'd been hunting that bottom for 20-some years. 5 mornings out of 5 that trip, I heard the gobble in the dark before first light and set up to call, and on the 4th morning, a long beard came in at 12 yards and I made a clean shot. That part of the trip was completely ordinary and completely good in the specific way that turkey hunting in the Ouachita country in April is good. What wasn't ordinary was the afternoon of that same day. I'd dressed the turkey and packed it in ice, and I was doing what I usually do after a morning kill, which is walk the property, look at the land, check the stand locations for any storm damage from the winter. I was in the south timber below the cabin, maybe a 1/4 mile south of the building, when I stopped and stood still for a reason I couldn't immediately identify. There's an instinct I've learned to trust over 30 years in the field. Something in your peripheral attention catches a pattern before your conscious attention does, and your body stops moving before your brain has decided why. I stood still in the south timber in the afternoon, and I didn't know why yet. Then I heard it, north of me from the direction of the cabin, a sound from the yard. Not the cabin's usual sounds, not the creak of the structure in the afternoon heat, not a branch hitting the roof. A sound that lasted maybe 3 seconds, and then stopped. I walked back to the cabin. It took me maybe 8 minutes. Everything looked normal from the outside. I went around the building and found nothing disturbed. On the south side, the side facing away from the creek, the side I'd never had any reason to check before, I found tracks in the loose soil next to the propane tank. The same configuration as the silt bar tracks from 2015. 14-inch length canine toe arrangement, minimal arch. 2 clear prints, towed in toward the south wall of the cabin, and then the trail went east across the yard and into the brush. Something had been on the south side of the cabin in the middle of the afternoon while I was in the south timber 200 yards away. I thought about the timing. I thought about whether it had been watching me and I hadn't noticed, whether it knew I was in the south timber, whether the reason it had been comfortable coming to the south side of the building was that it knew I wasn't in it. That's an unsettling thought, not because it implies threat, but because it implies observation. Something had been tracking my position on the property well enough to know when the cabin was empty and to come to the south side while I was out. That's not the behavior of an animal that happens to share terrain with humans. That's the behavior of something that monitors who's where and when. I wrote the entry and sat with it for a long time. October 2019. This is the trip I've mentioned, the one where I saw it clearly. I should spend more time here than I have. I was walking the northeast trail before first light, heading toward the saddle where the claw marks concentrated and where I'd been seeing rubs on the big white oaks, red filter on the headlamp. Moving quiet, the way you move in pre-dawn timber when you don't want to push anything ahead of you. The trail at that hour is a narrow gray line between black walls of brush, and I know every step of it without the light. But I kept the light on because the trail goes close to the creek at one point, and in the dark you can go off the edge of the bank before you see it. 40 feet ahead, on the trail, something stepped out of the trees. I want to try to describe this more carefully than I have before because it's the clearest sight I've ever had of one, and the detail matters. 7 feet tall, minimum, possibly more. Standing fully upright, not the forward hunch you see in a bear on its hind legs, not the crouch of a large animal that's been startled. Upright, like a person stands. The shoulders were extraordinarily wide, wider than any human shoulder I've seen, and the torso below them was deep and heavy. The arms hung at the sides, longer than human arm proportions would put them, reaching nearly to the knee. The hands were open. I could see the individual fingers. They were not the blunt mitt shape of a bear's paw. They were articulated, with what appeared to be substantial length in the fingers, and the nails or claws were visible as darker lines at the fingertips, curved slightly, not fully retracted. The legs were the most anatomically distinctive feature. They were bent at the knee in the configuration you see in canine hind limbs. The hock joint elevated from the ground, the leg angled backward from that joint to the foot. But these were not dog legs. They were human proportioned in length, large, built for sustained bipedal movement. The feet were wide and the stance was wide, stable, planted. This was not an animal struggling to balance on its hind legs. This was something that stood upright as its natural state. The head was a dog's head. I know how that sounds and I'm going to say it again. It was a dog's head. Not dog-like, not bear-like, not a rounded animal skull with a snout. A dog's head. The ears were up and forward and pointed, the ears of an alert German shepherd, and they were rotating slightly independently, scanning. The muzzle was long and heavy-jawed. The eyes were forward set, not the side of the head placement of a prey animal, and they caught the red light of my headlamp for a fraction of a second, with that specific eye-shine quality you get in animals that have a tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer behind the retina. That's why eyes glow in a flashlight beam. The eye-shine was amber, not the blue-white of deer, not the green of coyote. Amber. It turned its head and looked at me. I have been in situations that required immediate physical response. I've had a hunting confrontation with a wounded boar that was going very badly until it wasn't. I'm not someone who loses motor function under stress. I lost it for approximately 10 seconds. Not from panic, but from the specific kind of cognitive failure that happens when an input is so outside any existing framework that the brain stalls. It wasn't filing this under bear or person or threat. It was trying to build a new category from scratch. And while it was doing that, my body was simply not taking direction. We were there, both of us, 40 feet of trail between us. The red light on it, and whatever the dark was that was behind me on mine. After 10 seconds, maybe 12, it turned south, parallel to the creek line, not back the way it came, south. And it walked into the timber, not running. Walking with a stride that was smooth and even in covered ground without any of the effort you'd expect from something that size. The bulk moved like it wasn't weight, like it was just form. Within 8 steps it was into the brush, and within 20 it was gone. I turned around and walked back to the cabin, and I did not go into the north corner of the property again for the rest of that trip. The drive back to Tulsa from the Kiamichi takes about 3 hours on a good road day. I drove it that October with the radio off, the late afternoon light going orange through the post oaks on either side of the state highway. I kept running the image, not the way you run a frightening image, looking for escape from it, the way you run a technical problem, looking for precision. 14 images a second is what the human eye processes at full attention. I must have taken 14 images a second for 12 full seconds, which is 168 frames, and in those frames was more information than I'd managed to turn into words by the time I got home. I tried to draw it that night at the kitchen table, after my wife was asleep, and what came out wasn't good enough. It never is when you're trying to render something you've seen against a framework that doesn't have the right shapes. The drawing looked like something designed, rather than something that had evolved over whatever span of time had produced it. In November, I drove back down specifically to walk the Northeast Trail again, not to look for it, just to walk the ground, to stand in the place where it had stood and understand the sightlines. Standing in the physical space of a thing helps close the gap between what you saw and what you're able to hold accurately in memory. I walked the 40 feet of trail between my position and its position, and I stood in the spot where it had stood, in the tire track of its feet in the leaves, and I looked back south toward where I'd been. This is what it saw. A man with a red headlamp and a deer rifle stopped dead in the trail, not running, not raising the rifle. Just stopped. And it had looked at that for 12 seconds and decided to walk south and go home. I made the entry that night. I drew a figure in the notebook, as accurate as I could make it. The proportions I remembered, the stance, the head, the arm length. The drawing is in the second notebook, page 47, and it took me 2 hours to get it right. I'm not an artist, but I'm not bad at structural drawing from my year in architectural school, and I needed to get the proportions right, while the image was still sharp. I drove home, and I spent the winter doing research. The Michigan Dogman cases were the first reference point I found that matched what I'd seen closely enough to be relevant. Not the pop culture version, not the movie, not the song. The actual field reports collected by Linda Godfrey, who has been doing serious documentation on this phenomenon since the early 1990s in Wisconsin and Michigan. Her accounts from the Bray Road area in Walworth County, Wisconsin from 1989 onward, and the earlier historical accounts she traced in Michigan going back to the 1880s, describe the same cluster of features: 7 to 8 feet tall, bipedal, canine head, proportionally long arms, amber or yellow eye shine. The behavioral descriptions in her cases, the reports of high intelligence, of apparent assessment of the human witness, of non-aggressive stance unless provoked, matched what I'd experienced across 6 years of observation. What I didn't find in the literature, at least not in any account I read, was what I found in the Kiamichi: the long-term pattern, the 11-year relationship, the circle in the bark, the deer leg on the flat rock. Those things weren't in the accounts because the accounts are mostly single encounter reports from people who saw something once and reported it and never saw it again. What was happening on our property was something different, something ongoing. I found the Honobia monster accounts. Honobia is 4 miles north of our property, and it hosts an annual Bigfoot and related cryptid research conference in October, the Honobia Festival, which draws researchers and enthusiasts from across the country. I'd always dismissed it as local color. After October 2019, I drove up to the festival the following year. Not publicly, not in any presenting capacity. I went to listen. Specifically, I went to listen to the handful of presenters who were talking about canine bipeds rather than Bigfoot, because the two are different phenomena and often conflated in ways that muddy the analysis. What I heard at that conference was enough like what I'd been documenting, that the hair on my arms went up in the same way it had gone up the first time I heard the vocalization. A man from Arkansas talking about something he'd seen on his family's land on the upper Kiamichi drainage, in the hills north of the river. A woman from McCurtain County with track photographs that I would have been proud to have in my notebook. An older man who ran cattle in the Potato Hills area, which is 15 miles northeast of Honobia, who described the marks on his timber and the sounds from his north draw in language that was so close to my own notebook entries, it was disorienting. I drove home from that conference with the certainty that whatever was on our property was not unique to our property. It was a population. It was distributed across the Kiamichi and Ouachita drainages in a way that suggested real range, real territory, real population dynamics. And whatever the human relationship to them had been in this country, the instruction about the creek the rule about not going into certain timber. Those instructions had been maintained because the population had been maintained. They hadn't gone anywhere. They'd just been very, very careful. Spring 2020, I didn't get to the property at all. The world had a specific problem that year that made movement difficult. The cabin sat empty from February to December for the first time in 30 years. I thought about it a lot that winter, the property sitting quiet with nobody in the building and whatever was in the North Woods going about its patterns the way it always had, undisturbed. I wondered if the quiet made any difference to them. I wondered if the absence of smoke from the chimney and the absence of my truck on the gravel was noticed. The February 2021 trip was the first time I'd been back in over a year, which was the longest gap in the record. I was checking the place after the winter, seeing what the ice had done to the roof and whether the propane tank valve had held. The cabin was fine. I walked the property that first afternoon and made my way to the flat rock at the creek, the limestone shelf on the south bank at the natural crossing point, just to see the creek after a long absence. On the flat rock there was a deer leg, lower leg severed cleanly at the mid-cannon bone, the hoof intact and undamaged. No evidence of scavenging, no rodent gnaw marks, no fly activity. The cut fresh enough that there was still color in the tissue. Set on the flat rock in the orientation of a placed object, not a dropped one, the hoof toward the water and the cut end toward the bank. I stood there looking at it for a long time. We had put a deer apple on that flat rock in 2018, 3 years before, and now there was something on the flat rock when I returned after a 14-month absence. I know the objections. Deer legs get carried and dropped by coyotes, by bobcats, by vultures. The flat rock is a natural resting place for anything carrying something along the creek bank. I know all of that. The deer leg alone, without the context of the prior apple, without the context of 3 years of documented behavior indicating awareness of the relationship between our family and the North Woods, without the context of Marisol's intuition about leaving something and getting something back, might mean nothing. But it had context. I left it on the rock. I took a photograph. I walked back to the cabin and I wrote the entry, one of the longest entries in the third notebook, 7 pages, because I needed to think through the implications on paper. What I wrote at the end of those 7 pages was this. If this is reciprocity, it means the pattern I've been reading is more deliberate than I knew. It means the thing that stepped out of the trees on the Northeast Trail in October 2019 and looked at me for 12 seconds had an understanding of the exchange of objects between us that I hadn't given it credit for. It means the 3 years between the apple and the leg is a meaningful interval, not too long, not too short. Long enough that the return required patience and intention. Reciprocity implies a framework. A framework implies something that operates within one. And something that operates within a framework of reciprocity with a human family is not animal intelligence in the sense that word is usually used. Summer 2021. I spent a week on the property in June doing the systematic survey of the North Quadrant I described earlier. The binoculars work from the south bank, the transect through the north side timber, staying within 30 yards of the creek. 23 marked trees, the circle in the bark on the pines 60 yards north. The GPS coordinates noted for all of them. What I didn't tell you about that week is what happened on the 4th morning. I was at the creek at dawn, at the limestone crossing point, doing my survey of the north bank through the long glass. The light was coming in low from the east and hitting the north bank trees at an angle that made the bark texture pop, which is ideal for seeing the claw marks from a distance. I was working the glass east along the bank when something moved at the far edge of my field of view. I shifted the glass and held it. About 80 yards east, on the north bank, at the edge of the brush where the timber thickened, a shape was standing. Upright, still, looking at me. I held the glass on it for a full 30 seconds. It didn't move. It stood in the broken light at the tree line and looked at me across the water with the same quality of attention I'd felt in October 2019 on the trail, that specific awareness of being seen by something that was seeing me not as a threat or as prey, but as a known quantity. A familiar presence, something to be assessed on this particular morning, rather than something that had never been assessed before. After 30 seconds, it turned and moved back into the brush. I wrote the time in the notebook. 6:47 in the morning. Low sun, clear sky, wind light from the southwest. Distance estimated at 80 yards. Duration of observation, approximately 30 seconds. Subject: upright bipedal, tall, dark in color, at north tree line, appeared to observe before withdrawing. No vocalization. What I added at the bottom of the entry, in the small, careful notation I use when I'm adding an interpretation rather than a fact, was, "This was not accidental. It came to the bank at dawn, on the morning it could see me best, stood where I could see it clearly, and left when it was done. It showed itself on purpose." I don't know how to explain that in terms that don't sound like I'm projecting intent onto an animal, but the pattern across 7 years of notebook entries is consistent. The presences at the south bank of the creek correlate with mornings when I'm at the creek. The vocalizations correlate with nights when I'm in the cabin and the light is on. The tracks I find on the south bank correlate with periods of my activity on the property. It's not coincidence distribution. It's a pattern that responds to my presence. Fall 2021, November, I found the crossing tracks. South bank at the limestone shelf, prints coming from the north, crossing, going 12 feet into my side of the creek, turning around, going back. 12 feet, just inside the water line on the south bank, and then back. I measured the distance from the creek edge to the far point of the southern tracks. 4 meters, roughly 13 feet. No farther. I thought about that for a long time. The creek rule is a rule I keep. Whatever keeps the corresponding rule on the north side kept it too, to within 13 feet, and then honored it. But it came to the south bank. It stood on my side, just inside the line, long enough for the prints to set in the soft ground. And then it went back. Message received, I'm keeping the rule too. That March I talked to Portia Yancey for the first time. She's a field researcher based in Fayetteville who works the Ozark and Ouachita country on Dogman and related cryptid phenomena. She found my name through the Honobia network after a session I'd presented the previous October on track analysis methodology, just the measurement protocols and the anatomical implications of the track configurations I'd been documenting. Nothing that claimed more than the data supported. She called me and we talked for an hour. She's serious. That's the first thing I want to say about her. She doesn't embellish and she doesn't speculate beyond what she's documented, and she gets frustrated with the portion of the research community that treats evidence lightly. We agree on methodology. We agree that the accounts most worth taking seriously are the ones with physical corroboration and long-term patterns, not the single incident reports from people who saw something once and may have been looking at something explicable. She told me that the density of high-confidence Dogman reports in the Kiamichi drainage was higher than in any comparable region she'd worked in the eastern United States, higher than the Wisconsin Lake Country, higher than the Michigan cases, higher than anything she'd documented in the Ozarks north of the state line. She thought it was because the Kiamichi drainage had characteristics that the other high-density areas shared. The limestone cave systems, the specific mix of hardwood and pine that creates the kind of understory density a large animal needs for cover. The relative isolation from significant human development. The Kiamichi Valley doesn't have the kind of residential encroachment that the Ozarks north of Fort Smith have seen in the last 20 years. The timber companies operate on a rotation schedule, but they leave the ridge draws alone because the terrain is too steep for extraction. What's in those ridge draws is largely undisturbed. She asked if she could come out with recording equipment for a weekend. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks, and then I said no. The reason I said no is the pups. Which brings us to July 2022. Marisol was 10. She'd been coming to the cabin since she was 6, and by now she had her own preferences and her own knowledge of the land. She knew the southeast draw was where you sat if you wanted to watch turkeys without spooking them. She knew the limestone ledge on the south side of the creek was where the big channel catfish held in summer. She could identify every tree species on the property by bark alone, which I taught her the same way my uncle taught me, by touching them with her eyes closed and describing what she felt. Rough blocks for post oak, long plates for shortleaf pine, the thin, flaky sheets of the eastern red cedar that crumble when you pick at them. We went down in July, all 3 of us, which we'd never done. Summer in the Kiamichi is brutal and buggy, and the ticks are a genuine hazard. But Becca had gotten it in her head that Marisol should see the creek at its clearest and lowest, which is July, when the limestone filters the water down to something almost transparent. She was right. We went for a long weekend, and the creek was exactly what Becca had said it would be. On Saturday afternoon, Marisol went upstream along the south bank, while Becca and I sat in the chairs we'd brought down to the water. She was out of sight around the first bend within a few minutes. We were talking about something I can't recall, the kind of conversation you have when you're genuinely relaxed somewhere. When Marisol came back around the bend at a run, moving fast, her face lit with the specific expression I can only describe as controlled awe, the face she makes when something incredible has happened, and she doesn't want to blow it by making too much noise. She said, almost whispering, there were 3 of them. The big one and 2 small ones, and the small ones were in the water. I was on my feet before she finished the sentence. I said, where? She pointed upstream, across the creek, north bank. She said, they went into the trees when they heard me coming. We walked upstream to where she'd been. She showed me the spot, a gentle bend in the creek where the water slows and shoals over a flat of limestone, maybe 8 inches deep in the July low water, clear enough to see the bottom. On the north bank, in the silt deposit that had built up behind a cedar trunk, fallen partly into the water, there were prints. The large prints were 14 inches, 7 wide. Confirmed match to the 2015 silt bar tracks. 5 forward set toes, minimal arch, forward weight distribution. I had the tape measure in my vest pocket and I measured 4 of them. The smaller prints were 8 to 9 inches long. Same configuration, the same canine toe arrangement, just smaller. And they were paired with exactly what you'd expect from young animals in shallow water. The substrate was disturbed in a radial pattern around the print sites, silt pushed aside by movement, the irregular marks of feet that were picking up and setting down at play rather than walking with purpose. The pups, young ones, in the water, on a hot July afternoon when the creek was clear and cool over the limestone. Playing. I counted the large prints and measured the stride. The adult had been standing at the water's edge on the north bank, not crossing, just at the edge, in the position of something watching what was in the water, rather than being in the water itself. The depth of those prints was greater than the smaller ones, significantly greater, consistent with the weight differential you'd expect between an adult and juveniles. I looked at Marisol. She was crouching at the bank edge, looking at the prints, not at me, she said, still quiet. The big one stepped in front of them when it heard me. Between them and the creek, between them and me. She said, it didn't move, it just stood there. I said, for how long? She said, until the little ones were in the trees. Then it went too. I said, were the little ones scared? She said, they looked at me before they ran. She said, one of them kept looking back. On the drive home, Marisol was quiet for a long time, which is unusual for her on a car trip. She processes things internally, and then she says them when she's ready. After maybe an hour, she said, the big one was protecting them. I said, that's what it looked like. She said, do you think it knew I wasn't going to hurt them? I said, I think it didn't know yet for certain. She said, how would it know? I said, the same way we know things about the people and animals we share land with, by watching long enough. She thought about that. Then she said, we've been there 11 years. I said, we have. She said, so it's been watching us 11 years. That's exactly right. And what it had observed in 11 years was the creek rule kept, the deer apple on the flat rock, the absence of any aggressive action, the consistent pattern of a family going about its business in the south woods and the yard without disturbing the north woods. 11 years of watching us be what we were. And in July of 2022, it made a decision about what that meant. It brought the pups to the south bank of the creek. That's not an accident. An animal that makes a mistake brings its young near a potential threat. Whatever was north of that creek didn't make mistakes. It had been operating with precision for 11 years of our observation of it, and probably much longer. If it brought the juveniles to a place where a human child might see them, it was a decision. I thought about that for a long time, and I still think about it. The adult stepped in between when Marisol came around the bend. It covered the juveniles. That's protective instinct, and that's reassuring. It wasn't certain about her, but it let it happen. It was at the water's edge with them when she came around that bend. It could have kept them 50 yards back in the timber. It put them in the creek at a time of day when visibility was good, and the water was clear, and the south bank was accessible. It put them where a person walking the south bank would see them. I can't fully account for that. I can note that in the 11 years prior, the most deliberate moments of apparent contact, the vocalization from the north bank in November 2016, the dawn showing at the tree line in June 2021, All of them had the character of calculated disclosure, something that could have stayed fully hidden, choosing at a particular moment not to. That summer, I called Portia and told her about the pup sightings, and she was quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then she said, "That changes the picture for your site significantly." I said, "How so?" She said, "Juveniles means established breeding. It means the Kiamichi drainage isn't just habitat, it's home range." She said, "There are very few sites in my research where I can say with confidence that I'm looking at a breeding population rather than a transient animal." She said, "What you're describing is a family unit using your property as part of its established territory." I said, "Yes, that's what I believe." She said, "The fact that they let the child see the juveniles is significant." She was careful about what she said next. She said, "I don't want to project too much onto the behavior because we don't have the framework for it. But in the literature on large social predators, the introduction of young to novel stimuli is a deliberate parental behavior. It's controlled exposure." She said, "The adults decide when and where that happens." I said, "So the adult chose for Marisol to see them." She said, "That's what the evidence suggests." Fall 2022, November, I was at the property for 5 days. First 3 days quiet, normal hunting, 2 deer taken from the south timber, everything routine. On the 4th night, I woke at 2 in the morning to the low vocalization from the north, and it was different this time. Not one sound, not 2 sounds from different directions. Multiple sounds, from the north and the northeast and what seemed like the ridge to the east. 3 separate voices with the same frequency characteristic but distinct in quality, layered, almost simultaneous, the way a pack of coyotes layers its calls, but much lower and slower, and with a quality that had nothing to do with coyote communication. I lay in the dark and counted 3, at least 3 distinct voices. And then, silence. I wrote in the notebook, pack vocalization, multiple individuals, possibly adult and juvenile voices mixed, the lower register dominant but with a slightly different quality on 2 of the sounds that might be younger voices, not fully deepened, cannot confirm. But the number alone is significant. This is not a single animal or a mated pair. This is a group. The July sightings had shown me 2 juveniles with 1 adult. The November vocalization suggested at least 3 individuals, possibly more, in the North Woods simultaneously. I updated my population estimate in the notebook. Not a solitary animal, not a pair. A social group of unknown size, minimum 3, operating in the north quadrant of the property and the adjacent timber above it on the ridge. I thought about the Choctaw Nation administrative records from the 1880s that I'd found at the Gilcrease Museum, the areas noted as avoided for what the translation called traditional avoidance, the areas that corresponded to the drainage above our creek line. Those records went back to the beginning of the Choctaw presence in the valley, which was the 1830s, and whatever they were avoiding had been there when they arrived, had been there long enough that the avoidance was already established, already old, already a rule without a reason, the reason having passed into the deep history of a place. I thought about that population that had been here for centuries, at minimum, holding its territory in the ridge draws and the deep timber above the creek line. I thought about what it had watched. The Choctaw families come and work the valley below it, the white settlers come in behind them, my uncle come and build a cabin and start keeping a rule the older families already knew. Generation after generation of humans below the creek line, and the group above the creek line, watching, adapting, maintaining the arrangement. An arrangement that old has weight. An arrangement that old is not something one family disturbs for a weekend with recording equipment. I understand why Portia wanted to come. She's doing important work, and the acoustic and visual documentation she could produce from the site would be significant. But I have a different responsibility. The family above the creek has been maintaining its side of this arrangement for longer than any documentation could justify disrupting. I'm not going to be the generation that breaks it. Summer 2023. July again. Me and Marisol, Becca couldn't come that weekend, and I think in some ways I wanted it to be just the 2 of us. Marisol was 11 by then, old enough to sit still for a long time and observe without fidgeting. She's been developing that skill since she was small, and by 11 she had it. She can watch a tree for 20 minutes without moving and tell you afterward everything that happened in it. We positioned ourselves on the south bank about 200 yards upstream from the bend where she'd seen them the previous July. We were there by 2:30 in the afternoon, Both of us settled against a limestone outcrop with good sight lines across the creek. We waited. At 3:47, I felt the low vibration before I heard anything. That specific quality of the vocalization, the version that hits the sternum first. It came from north of the creek, not close, somewhere up in the timber. Brief, one sound, and then nothing for 12 minutes. Then movement on the north bank. 60 yards upstream, at the shoal crossing, two shapes came to the water's edge. The same two juvenile pattern as the previous year, but they were bigger, not pup-sized anymore. Between the small juvenile prints of July 2022 and the adult prints, these fell in the middle. Subadults moving with more coordination than I'd expect from young animals, but still with the loose-jointed quality of things that haven't quite grown into their size. They came to the water, they didn't cross. They waded the north bank shallows, the water up to what would be ankle height on something their size, and they moved in the shoal water with the ease of animals that know this particular crossing. That had been here before. That came back because they knew this was a place they came. Marisol didn't move. She was watching through her binoculars, small ones I'd given her 2 Christmases ago, and her elbows were on her knees, and she was completely still. The adult came to the north bank edge 17 minutes into the observation, not at the shoal where the juveniles were, 50 yards downstream of them, at a high limestone bank where it had a clear view of the entire south bank, and could see both the juveniles in the water and us in our position against the outcrop. It stood there, and it looked south across the creek. I trained my binoculars on it. At this distance and this light, I could see it more clearly than I'd seen anything since the 2019 trail encounter. The ears were up, rotating periodically, gathering sound. The eyes were forward, and they were on the south bank, specifically on our position, specifically on us. Not scanning, not alert in the threat response sense. Watching in the way, I watched the tree line at dawn, with attention but without alarm. I lowered my binoculars. Not because I was afraid, because it seemed like the right thing to do. Lowering the binoculars was the equivalent of looking away from a dog you don't know. Not submission, just acknowledgement that you're not trying to dominate the interaction. The adult held its position for about 6 minutes. Then one of the subadults made a sound from the shoal, a short sound, higher pitched than the adult vocalizations, and the adult gave the short, low response, and they came out of the water and went north into the timber. The adult stayed on the high bank for another 2 minutes, watching the south bank once more before it turned and went. Marisol put her binoculars down after they were gone, and she turned to me, and she looked like someone who has seen something she will carry her whole life. Not shaken, full. She said, "They were different sizes." I said, "They've been growing since last year." She said, "So they come back every summer." I said, "Seems like it." She said, "To the same place." I said, "To the same place." She said, "And the big one watched us the whole time." I said, "Yes." She said, "Because it knew where we were." I said, "I think so." She sat with that for a moment, and then she said, "So it knew we were going to watch, and it let us, because it already decided we were okay." And I said, "That's how I read it." She said, "So, they're teaching the little ones too, about us, the same way you've been teaching me about them." I didn't have anything to add to that. She'd described it more precisely than I had. What I was watching from the South Bank was not just the Dogman family going about its life. I was watching an intergenerational transfer of knowledge on both sides of the creek. The adults showing the subadults, this is a place we come. These are humans. This is how we exist near them. And I was there with my 11-year-old daughter, showing her the same thing from our side. That's what a 30-year-old arrangement looks like when it's working. November 2023, my annual week before Thanksgiving. The first 2 days I hunted the South Timber and found nothing I wanted to take. The land was in its late November state, the leaves fully off the hardwoods, the sky visible through the canopy, the ground frozen hard in the mornings and thawing to mud by noon. On the morning of day 3, I found a new size of track at the limestone crossing, 11 inches long, 6 inches wide at the ball. Same canine toe configuration as all the others. Between the adult's 14-inch track and the 8 to 9-inch juvenile tracks from 2022, a third size, something growing from juvenile to subadult, or a separate individual of intermediate age. I measured 3 complete prints, and the stride came to 53 inches, which is consistent with something in the 3 to 5 year age range of bipedal development, If you apply a rough scaling from what I know of similar anatomy, the tracks were on the south bank at the crossing. Same pattern I'd been seeing for years. Came from the north, crossed, went a short distance south, returned north. The southern penetration was a bit deeper this time, about 20 feet from the creek edge. I measured, I added the entry to the third notebook and cross-referenced it with the 2022 and 2023 summer entries, the subadult observations at the shoal. I believe I'm watching the same individuals across multiple years. The juvenile prints of July 2022, becoming the subadult observations of July 2023, becoming the 11-inch crossing tracks of November 2023, the same animals growing up, coming to the creek, learning the route, being shown. On the evening of day 4, I was in the stand on the southwest corner with a clear view north toward the creek and at last light, 5:20, and the sky going orange behind the ridge to the west. The adult came to the north bank. It came out of the timber onto the high limestone bank and stood there and looked south. It found me in the stand within maybe 10 seconds, which is not surprising since by that point it knew the stand location, had probably known it for years. It looked at me for a moment, and then beside it, at the bank edge but slightly back in the brush, a smaller shape appeared. The intermediate-size individual, standing beside the adult, looking south across the creek, looking at the man in the stand at last light. 2 of them acknowledging me. One adult, showing one younger one. This is the man. He's in the stand tonight. Watch how this works. I sat in that stand until it was too dark to see, and I did not take it for granted for 1 second. July 2024. The trip. That's the reason I'm telling you all of this now. The reason I decided the full account was worth saying out loud. I had a 200mm telephoto lens I'd borrowed from a photographer friend, mounted on the digital camera I keep at the cabin, specifically to try to get better images at the shoal crossing than I'd been able to get with my equipment in 2023. I'd spent 4 hours the night before my South Bank stakeout position, reviewing what I knew about the shoal crossing pattern. They came in the mid-afternoon, between 2 and 4, usually in the first hour and a half of that window, based on the 2022 and 2023 observations. I was in position at the limestone outcrop by 1:45. The 200mm puts you close enough at 60 yards to resolve real detail if the light is good enough. The July afternoon light in the Kiamichi, that specific quality of late afternoon sun through limestone country haze, is good for detail, but not great for contrast. I'd brought a polarizing filter. I'd practiced the settings at home on my own property to have the right exposure dialed in. At 3:12, 2 shapes came to the north bank at the shoal. They were bigger than they had been in July 2023, significantly bigger. The size gap between them and a full adult was narrowing. One of them was close to adult-sized, maybe 90% of the height, moving with an adult's coordination, none of the loose quality I'd noted the year before. The other was still clearly younger, still had the sub-adult proportion in the length of its legs relative to its torso. I raised the camera and started shooting. I'm going to be honest about the photographs, which is the only honest thing to be. The images show 2 upright forms at the north bank of the creek at the shoal crossing. They show forms that are not deer, not bear, not elk, not any animal I can identify. The taller form shows an upright posture that is clearly bipedal and not the upright standing posture of a bear, which I know well. The head profile, where it's visible, shows the forward set ears and the long muzzle of the canine configuration, rather than the rounded head of a bear. You can see these things in the photographs. What you cannot see with certainty in the photographs is everything you'd want. The light angle and the tree canopy create dappling that makes the forms harder to resolve than they were to my naked eye. The body fur is dark and absorbs light and doesn't give clean edge definition. The photographs are evidence of something. They are not the kind of evidence that ends arguments. I know what I saw. The camera captured what the camera could capture. The larger subadult was in the water for about 12 minutes. The smaller one was on the bank for most of that time, coming to the water's edge and back, the way a younger animal acts when the older sibling has done something first and it's deciding whether to follow. At about the 8-minute mark, the smaller one went in, both of them in the creek in the July shallows. The adult came to the high bank at the 12-minute mark, the same position as July 2023, downstream, line of sight on both the subadults and the south bank. It found me immediately. I had the camera up, and I shot a long burst in the adult's direction, knowing the images would be marginal at the distance, and knowing that the one photograph I might get that captured something real would be worth the attempt. The adult looked at me. I looked at the camera screen, and in the camera screen, at 200 millimeters from 60 yards, I watched the adult's ears shift, just for a moment. Not a threat response, not a freeze. The ears shifted toward the subadults in the water, and then came back to me, and there was something in that rotation, in the time between the shift and the return, that I know from watching animals my whole life. A parent whose attention is divided between a child and a potential concern, and who comes back to the concern not because it's escalating, but because responsibility requires it. The same thing a parent does at a playground when a kid falls. You look away to the sound, you look back to the main threat vector, you assess. That's the sequence. The ears did exactly that. I lowered the camera, we stayed there, the adult on the north bank and me on the south, for about 3 minutes. Then one of the subadults made a sound, and the adult gave the short, low response, and they came out of the water and went north into the timber. The adult watched the south bank for another minute and then followed. I sat against the limestone outcrop for a long time after they were gone. The creek moved in its slow July way over the shale, and the late afternoon light went gold the way it goes in the Kiamichi in late summer. That specific heavy gold of the Ouachita country that you don't see the same way anywhere else. I thought about my uncle building this cabin in 1989 and coming out to use the outhouse 2 years later and seeing something at the tree line that he couldn't name. I thought about him sitting with his rifle until morning and then coming back the next weekend and the weekend after that and working out in whatever way he worked it out, that whatever was there was not what he needed the rifle for. I thought about 35 years of this family on this land. I thought about Marisol saying the little ones weren't scared of her. I thought about the deer leg on the flat rock. Then I packed the camera and walked back to the cabin, and I sat on the porch, and Becca came out with 2 cups of coffee, and she said, "You saw them," and I said, "All 3," and she said, "Good." She just said, "Good." The following month, August 2024, I got a call from Darvis. He called to tell me about a brush fire on the West Ridge. Nothing that reached our property contained quickly. Before he hung up, he said, "While I've got you," he said, "I saw something on your north property this spring." I said, "What did you see?" He said, "I was on your fence line on the west side clearing brush, and I saw something cross the north timber at the top of the ridge." He said, "It was the first time I'd seen one clearly." He said, "I've heard them. I've seen shapes, but this was clear." I asked him, "What did it do?" He said, "It crossed the ridge going east, moving steady, not hurried. It saw me, and it saw that I saw it." He said, "It stopped for a second and looked at me, and then it kept going." He said, "It wasn't afraid." I said, "No." He said, "It didn't seem afraid, and it didn't seem like it was going to do anything. It was just going somewhere." He said, "I've been on this land my whole life, and my father before me, and his father before him, and none of us has ever had a problem with whatever's up there on the North Ridge." He said, "Some things you learn to live alongside." He said, "Clete understood that, and it looks like you do too." I said, "I'm trying." He said, "You're doing it right." He said, "Just keep the creek rule." I said, "I will." He said, "Good." He said, "Give my best to your wife and that girl of yours." He hung up, and I held the phone and thought, 3 generations of the Holk family on the land across the road. 3 generations of the same awareness and the same rule. Whatever is in the North Ridge and the North Timber above the creek has been alongside the human families in this valley for at least that long, and probably much longer. The families kept their rules, and the thing above the creek kept its side of the arrangement, and here we all are, 3 generations in, the arrangement still holding. Let me tell you about the notebook itself, because I've mentioned it throughout, and it deserves more than a mention. The first notebook is a standard spiral bound from a Walmart in McAllister. I started it in November 2014. The first entry is dated the 14th, and it describes the footfall around the cabin and the impressions at the northwest corner. The handwriting in that first entry is looser than what follows, because I hadn't settled into the format yet. It reads more like I was getting it out of my system than documenting it. By the 3rd entry, I'd started dating consistently in recording conditions. By the 10th entry, from the October 2015 Silt Bar tracks, I had something approaching a system. From 2017 onward, when I bought the second notebook, I had the full format: date, time, moon phase, temperature, wind, cloud cover, precipitation, visibility, and then the observation in as close to neutral language as I could manage. Then measurements and drawings on the facing page. The claw mark diagrams are some of the best drawings in the notebooks. I spent a year in architectural school before I changed to forestry, and the drafting instinct is useful here. Each diagram shows the mark pattern, the height above ground, the spacing between lines, the depth differential if I can judge it, and a scale bar. Someone could take those diagrams into the North Timber and find the trees I drew them from. I've walked back to 8 of the marked trees in subsequent years and confirmed the marks are still there, deepening in some cases as new scratches are added over old ones. The track tracings are in the second and third notebooks. I press the notebook flat on the substrate, center the page over the print, trace the outline and the toe impressions and any depth information I can indicate with shading. Then I pull the page back and add measurements and a scale bar and the GPS coordinate. The 2022 silt bar tracings from the July pup sighting are the most detailed in the record. The large adult track is traced 4 times from 4 separate prints, and when you overlay the 4 tracings they align to within a 1/4 inch, which is about as good as the freehand tracing gets. The third notebook has the circle photograph printed and taped in, at actual size, alongside a drawing of it. It has the deer leg photograph. It has 18 photographs of the 2024 sub-adult sightings, printed at the photo lab in Talihina, each one labeled and annotated. It has the conversation with Darvis from August 2024, written out as close to verbatim as memory allows, the same way I documented the conversation with Delma in 2017. The notebook is not a proof, I know that. A notebook is not the same as a body, but what it is a record. A consistent, dated, measured, cross-referenced record of 11 years of observation on a specific piece of land. And that record tells a coherent story about an ongoing relationship between a human family and something that lives in the North Woods. Marisol has read portions of the second notebook, not all of it. She's read the entries I've flagged for her. The 2015 silt bar tracks, the first vocalization, the conversation with Delma, the pup sightings, the February snow. She read the February snow entry on the porch of the cabin in October of last year. Sitting in the chair I always use, the notebook open across her knees, the woods going gold around her in the afternoon. When she finished, she sat there for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "You should add more about what it smells like." She said, "The way you write it, I can see everything, but I can't smell it." She was right. I'd written the visual and acoustic record with care, and I'd been careless about the olfactory record, which in the Kiamichi country is as specific and as distinctive as anything you can see or hear. The smell of the creek on a cold morning, tannin and limestone, and the particular cold water smell of creek gravel that every person who has knelt at a clear Uwachita stream knows as completely as they know their own kitchen. The smell of the pine timber on the north bank on a summer afternoon when the resin is running and the heat brings it out into air, you can taste at the back of your throat. The smell of the cabin after a week without heat, that particular closed-up cedar and old wool smell that opens into something human and lived in the moment you get the propane going again. She was right. I went home and added the smell to the next entry. I'm adding it now. When I'm gone, and I mean when I'm genuinely gone, when the property passes to Marisol or whoever she leaves it to, I want the notebook to go with it. I want whoever has the land to have what I have, which is not certainty, which is not proof, but which is the record of what the land holds and how the arrangement has worked. I want them to know about the creek rule before they break it by accident. I want them to know about the flat rock and what you put on it. I want them to know what the vocalization sounds like, and that it comes in response to your presence on the property, not in threat, and that the right thing to do when you hear it is to write down the time and go back to sleep. I want them to know that the pups come to the creek in July if you've been keeping the arrangement well, that the adult watches from the high bank, and that if you lower your optics when it looks at you, it acknowledges that the circle in the bark on the pines 60 yards north of the creek is still there and still getting new additions every few years, and that nobody knows exactly what it means, but that it's clearly intentional. Some things should be passed down in words and not just in the creek rule and the way you stop at the water's edge without explaining why. Marisol asked me on the drive home from the July 2024 trip whether the subadults would keep coming to the creek as they got older. I said, I think so. I think it's a place they know. I think they were brought there when they were young, and they'll keep coming back the way you come back to places you were brought when you were young. She said, like us coming to the cabin. I said, exactly like that. She said, so they have their cabin and we have ours and the creek is what's between them. I said, that's one way to put it. She was quiet for a mile or so. Then she said, I think when I have the land, I'll keep the rule. I said, I know you will. She said, and I'll keep putting the apple on the flat rock. I said, yes. She said, even when I don't see anything for a long time, I'll keep putting it there. I said, especially then. She nodded. She looked out the window at the Ouachita country going past in the late afternoon. She said, I think they know we're going to keep it. I said, I think they do too. I believe that the way I believe the creek runs east to west, and the light goes gold in the Kiamichi in late July, and the forest keeps trying to reclaim what you've cleared. Some things you come to know the same way you know the land you love. Not because someone proved it to you, but because you paid attention long enough and the evidence accumulated into something you couldn't reasonably call anything else. The arrangement holds. The pups are growing. Next July, the creek will be low and clear over the limestone, and if Marisol walks the south bank, she'll hear them in the water on the north side. And the adult will be on the high bank watching, and it'll find her, and she'll lower her binoculars, and nothing will happen except two kinds of living things acknowledging each other across a line that both of them have decided is worth keeping. That's enough. In all the ways that word has meaning, that is enough. Some things should be passed down in words, not just in silence and in the creek rule and in the way you stop at the bank and look north before you turn around. This is the words. There's something I've been holding back because it's the hardest part to say clearly, and I want to try to say it clearly before I close this. In 12 years of keeping this record, I've had moments where I wondered if I was constructing a pattern that wasn't there. That's a legitimate concern, and I applied it to myself honestly. Humans are pattern recognition animals. We see faces in clouds and conspiracies and coincidences and meaning in the random. I know that. I've tried to hold it against the record at every step. What I've come back to, every time I apply that skepticism, is the specificity. It's the detail that resists the pattern projection critique. When I say the stride length on the 2015 silt bar tracks was 68 inches, that's a measurement. It's not a feeling. When I say the claw marks on 23 North Bank trees all start at the same height range, between 7 and 8 feet, and all run downward, and all have the same 4 to 5 inch outer line spacing, that's a measurement. When I say the July crossing showed prints that size between the adult and the juvenile tracks documented in prior years, consistent with the growth rate of the individuals I believe I've been watching across multiple seasons, that's a measurement derived from a series of measurements over time. Measurements don't project patterns. They either fit a pattern or they don't, and these fit. The behavioral specificity compounds the physical specificity. The timing of the South Bank crossing tracks correlates with my activity on the property in a way that's too consistent to attribute to coincidence. The fact that the vocalization comes at night when the cabin lamp is on and I'm present and falls silent when I'm not there is something I can cross-reference against 14 months of absence in 2020 and early 2021, after which I came back to find the deer leg on the flat rock. The behavior responds to my presence and my absence. That's not coincidence distribution, that's tracking. Something has been tracking my presence on this property for 11 years. Not tracking in a predatory sense, tracking in the sense of monitoring, of knowing where I am and what I'm doing and adjusting accordingly. The awareness that I was in the South Timber on that spring afternoon in 2019 and the subsequent visit to the south side of the cabin in my absence requires knowing I was gone. A thing that knows when you're in the South Timber and when you've left is a thing that's been watching you long enough to read your patterns. That's not an animal I have a category for. That's a kind of intelligence that doesn't fit the frameworks we use to talk about wildlife. It's not human intelligence, or it doesn't need to be. But it's something that has been attending to my family's presence on this land with a consistency and an accuracy that demands a word I don't have. My uncle sat with his rifle until morning in 1991. He put the rifle down and came back. Whatever he decided in that process, he never spoke it out loud except in the one conversation we had in November 2012. But the decisions he made afterward speak for themselves. He built the cabin into the land, and he kept his rules, and he spent 20 years alongside whatever was north of the creek, and he never had an ounce of trouble with it. He died in his own bed in the spring of 2013, and the last time he was well enough to go to the property was the previous October, when we sat on the porch with the bad coffee, and he told me the one thing he'd been keeping for 20 years. It never did a thing to me. That's his whole testimony. It never did a thing to him. And in 11 years of my own observation, it has never done a thing to me, to Becca, to Marisol, to Darvis. It has communicated. It has observed. It has made decisions, deliberate decisions that I can trace through the record about disclosure and proximity and the pace at which it's let us see more. The pups in the water was not a random event. The subadults at the shoal crossing was not a random event. The adult watching from the high bank was not a random event. There is an intelligence north of that creek that has decided, over 30 years of watching this family, that we are something it can afford to let see it. That is a different relationship than wildlife and human. I don't know what it is. I have the notebook, and I have the creek rule, and I have a flat rock with an apple on it. And I have a 12-year-old daughter who said, "I think they know we're going to keep it." She's right. They know. Whatever it is that they know with, however long they've been knowing things about the humans below the creek line, they know that this family is going to keep the arrangement. I'll be back next November with the notebook and the tape measure and the long lens. Marisol will come in July. Becca will sit on the south bank in the afternoon light and watch the creek the way she watched that spike buck in the fog on her first November here, with the particular quality of attention she has for things that are worth her time. The arrangement holds. The creek runs east to west. The apple goes on the flat rock. Whatever comes back will be in the notebook. Let me tell you about the winter tracking, because I've referenced the cold weather entries in the notebook, and I haven't given them the time they deserve. The Kiamichi in winter is a different country from the Kiamichi in summer, or even in November. December and January strip the last color out of the hardwoods and leave the ridges gray and bare, enough that you can see farther into the north timber from the south bank than you can in any other season. The cedar and shortleaf pine hold their green, but they thin out in the north quadrant above the creek, and in a good ice storm, the understory gets pushed down and the sightlines open up even further. The ground freezes hard by January, and the creek ices at the edges while the spring-fed center keeps running, and in that center current, the bed stays clear of snow, and you can see the shale through 6 inches of cold water that's as transparent as anything. I've done 3 deliberate winter survey trips: December 2018, December 2022, and February 2023. All of them produced findings that don't appear in the warm season record. December 2018 was the ice storm trip I described briefly, the fence postmark. But what I didn't fully describe was the 3 hours I spent on the south bank the morning of the first full day, before I'd found the fence postmark, working the binoculars along the north bank tree line. In winter, with the understory down, you can see the shape of the terrain differently. The north timber above the creek has a topography that the leaf-on seasons conceal. There's a bench about 100 yards north of the water, a flat platform in the hillside that collects soil and holds bigger trees, and behind it, the slope rises sharply toward the ridge. I'd known the bench was there from the topographic map, but I'd never had a clear view of it from the south bank. In December 2018, with the ice bringing down the understory and the bare hardwoods giving me line of sight, I could see the bench and what was on it: beds. 3 of them, visible from the south bank at the bench. Depressions in the leaf litter large enough to see clearly through the long glass. Each one a roughly oval compression, 3 to 4 feet across. The leaf litter pushed flat in the center and accumulated at the edges the way it does when a large animal has been lying in a place for long enough for the body heat to push the litter outward. 3 separate beds, arranged on the bench in a rough triangle, each one maybe 8 to 10 feet from the others. 3 individuals sleeping on that bench, or resting on it, at a height above the creek where they'd have a view down to the south bank in all directions, where the slope gave them cover behind and visibility in front, where the bench itself would hold body heat better than the open slope. A sensible place to rest if you wanted to monitor the approach to the creek line from a position of elevation and concealment. I photographed what I could see of the beds through the binoculars. The images are in the notebook at the December 2018 entries. They're distant enough to require annotation, but the annotation is accurate. February 2023 was the most productive winter trip in terms of track evidence. It had snowed 3 days before I arrived, maybe 4 inches, enough to put a clean white surface over the entire property. Snow tracking is the gold standard for understanding what moves on a piece of land because the record is complete. Everything that crossed the snow after it fell is in the snow, and if you read it methodically, you can reconstruct an entire night's worth of movement. I walked the property systematically, north to south and east to west, spending that first full day doing nothing but tracking. What the snow showed me on the south side of the property was ordinary: deer trails, turkey scratchings, squirrel travel between the mass trees, coyote running the fence lines, a bobcat working the brush pile at the south corner. All the usual residents doing what they do. What the snow showed me on the south bank of the creek was not ordinary. 3 separate sets of bipedal tracks, coming from the north, crossing the creek at the usual limestone shelf, fanning out on the south bank, and then converging again at a point about 30 yards south of the water before all 3 turned and went back north. 30 yards south, significantly farther south than any prior crossing evidence I'd documented. And 3 sets, 3 individuals, which matched the vocalization evidence from November 2022 and the bed count from December 2018. I measured everything I could. The tracks were partially wind-drifted but readable. The large set, the adult I'd been tracking since 2015, measured true on the length at 13.5 inches, slightly smaller than the summer measurements from the silt bar, which is consistent with the compression behavior of a print in snow versus a print in silt. Snow compresses more and makes the outline look slightly smaller. The intermediate-sized set, the one I'd first documented in November 2023 on hard clay, was present in snow at 10.5 inches, again slightly compressed. And the third set was between the two, 11.5 inches. A third individual I hadn't clearly separated out in prior tracking. 3 individuals, the adult and 2 subadults at different stages, had crossed to the south bank together and walked 30 yards south, stopped and gone back. Together. I sat in the snow at the convergence point, the spot where all 3 sets of tracks stopped and turned, and I looked south toward the cabin. The cabin was visible from that point, not clearly, not close, but you could see the dark shape of the building through the bare trees, and you could see the chimney, and if I'd had the fire going, you could have seen the smoke. They had walked 30 yards south of the creek and stood together and looked at the cabin, and then they'd gone back. I want to try to describe what sitting in that snow actually felt like, because I've talked around it in the notebook, and talking around it is not the same as saying it. The cold was 12 degrees and falling. My boots were waterproof, but the cold was through them anyway by the time I'd been at the convergence point for 30 minutes. The sky was the specific pale white of an overcast winter sky in the Ouachita country, the color of old bone, and the light through it was flat and sourceless, the kind of light that makes everything look equally close. The tracks were around me, large ones and smaller ones, all pointing south, all pointing at the building where I'd slept 4 nights in a row. And I sat in the center of that pointing, and I thought about my uncle in 1991 sitting on the porch of the cabin he'd built himself out of a coffee can's worth of savings. And I thought about all the nights between his 1991 porch sit and my 2023 snow sit. 32 years of this family and whatever was in the North Woods working out what we were to each other. I thought about what it meant that the working out was still happening, that whatever was on the north side of the creek was still, 32 years later, bringing the young ones to new vantage points and showing them. This building, these humans, this is what we exist alongside. Something was still investing in this relationship, still teaching it, still treating it as something worth the teaching. I sat in the snow until I could not feel my feet, and then I stood up and walked back to the cabin, and I turned on every lamp in the place and made the worst coffee you've ever tasted, and drank it standing at the window looking north. Whatever had been on the south bank, whatever had taken the young ones to the south side to stand 30 yards from my window, might have seen that light. I hoped it had. I don't have a framework for what those tracks mean. I've offered it to Portia, and she didn't have a confident framework for it either. She said, group behavior at a specific target location, if that's what this is typically associated with curiosity or familiarization or social learning. She said, The fact that they went together rather than separately suggests the more experienced individual, the adult, was taking the younger ones somewhere, for a reason. The adult took the subadults to the south bank in the snow at night to stand 30 yards from the cabin and look at it, teaching them something about the building, about the humans who occupy it, about the relationship between the north woods and the south side of the creek, about what this place is and how to exist near it. I sat in the snow for a long time. My breath made clouds. The property was completely silent except for the wind in the bare treetops. And in that silence, looking at 3 overlapping sets of bipedal tracks pointing toward the place where I slept, I felt something I've been trying to find the right word for since. Not fear, definitely not that. Not awe exactly, though there's something in that direction, something closer to recognition. The feeling you get when something you've been slowly coming to understand becomes suddenly clearer, when the evidence you've been accumulating for years resolves into a picture that was there the whole time, waiting for you to have enough pieces. The picture is this: they know us. They have been knowing us for as long as we've been on this land, and longer before that. Since the Hulk family across the road, since the Choctaw Nation families in the valley, since whatever community was here before them and left the instruction in Delma's grandfather's keeping without a reason attached. They have been watching a succession of human families come to this particular piece of land and keep a particular rule, and they have been maintaining their end of the arrangement the whole time. The arrangement is not a détente. It's not 2 parties tolerating each other's presence and staying out of each other's way. What I've been documenting for 11 years is something more than that. Something that started long before my uncle built the cabin, and that has been developing, slowly, at the pace things develop when they develop through generations. They came to the south bank in the snow at night to show the younger ones the cabin. That's not tolerance, that's education. And you educate about something because it matters. Because the younger generation needs to know how to exist alongside it. We matter to them, not as food, not as threat, not as resource. As the family that is on the other side of the creek, as the people who keep the rule. That's what I've been building toward for 11 years, without fully seeing it until I sat in the snow in February 2023 and looked at 3 sets of tracks pointing at my cabin. We are known. I drove home that trip and I told Becca, and she sat with it in her way, and then she said, "So it's the same on both sides. They're telling the young ones about us the same way we're telling Marisol about them." I said, "Yes." She said, "So we're their story too." She's right. We're their story. The humans below the creek who put the apple on the flat rock. The family that keeps the rule. The people it's okay to show the pups to. I don't know what they call us. I don't know if they call us anything. But I know they tell their young about us. I know because I watched an adult take 2 subadults to the south bank in a February snowfall and stand 30 yards from the cabin where the man who keeps their creek rule was sleeping and show them. This is it. This is what we exist alongside. Remember, that's what I believe happened, and I believe it because it's the only interpretation that fits the totality of what the snow showed me that morning, what 12 years of the notebook shows me, what Delma told me in her kitchen, what Darvis said from the tailgate of his truck, what my uncle said on the porch with the bad coffee before he died. Some things are true because the evidence for them is overwhelming, even when none of the individual pieces is definitive by itself. The tracks are not definitive, the vocalizations are not definitive, the claw marks are not definitive, the deer leg on the flat rock is not definitive, the pups in the creek are not definitive, the circle in the bark is not definitive. But 11 years of consistent, documented, cross-referenced, measured observations on a specific piece of land in which every individual finding fits the same pattern, in which the behavior responds systematically to my presence and absence, in which the pattern extends beyond my family's observation to include 3 generations of the Hulk family across the road, and Delma Birdsong's 70 years in the valley, and the Choctaw Nation administrative records from the 1880s. In which the instruction about the creek has been passed down through multiple communities across at least 150 years. That totality is something. That's what I've got. That's all of it. 12 years and 3 notebooks and a flat rock and a creek that runs east to west. The apple goes on the rock, the rule holds. We keep our side, they keep theirs. And in July, when the creek runs clear over the limestone and the dragonflies are on the water, the pups will come to the south bank of the creek because that's what they do. because they were brought there when they were young, and they come back the way you come back to places that mean something. The way Marisol comes back to the cabin. The way I come back to the cabin. The way my uncle came back to the cabin every season from 1989 until he couldn't anymore. Some places hold you. Some arrangements are worth keeping. And some things, the ones that matter most, you pass down in words so they don't have to be rediscovered by the next person who stands at the south bank of the creek and wonders what's on the other side.